Welcome to the Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others. Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Podcast Studios in Rochester, New York. Mouth off at RockVox. RockVox.com. Having enjoyed a 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, executive and recovery coach, Keith Greer.
Welcome, everybody. And as always, thank you so much for making the time to sit in with me today on the Helping Conversation. Christina Maslach is a pioneer researcher on the subject of burnout, and she is connected to the University of California at Berkeley. She defines burnout as something that refers to a syndrome of emotional exhaustion and cynicism that frequently occurs among people who do people work, who spend considerable time in close encounters. People suffering from burnout generally have the following identified characteristics: chronic fatigue, anger at those making demands, self-criticism for putting up with the demands, cynicism, negativity, and irritability, a sense of being besieged, and hair-triggered display of emotions. In an article in the 2020 Harvard Business Review, they cited a survey of 3,900 employees and business leaders across 11 nations and discovered that burnout and fatigue are equally concerning for employees working remotely and those in the physical workplace. Overall, 3 in 5 employees and business leaders say their organization has taken at least some measures to guard against burnout, though nearly a third of employees wish organizations would act with more empathy. And what I loved about that statement is that last word, because that is not a word that has historically been attached to leadership, our need to be empathic to others. The article went on to say the key word here is empathy. The author states that in my communication with leaders, I encourage them to rethink the definition of empathic leadership, particularly as it pertains to preventing burnout. We tend to connect empathy to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but I don't believe that goes far enough. If you authentically want to demonstrate empathy, you have to, quote, do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. That requires stepping outside of your needs, assessing and removing bias and privilege, actively listening to your people, and then taking action. I share that with you in preparation for introducing my guest today, who is going to talk in detail about her work in this area and with leadership and the things that she does in helping leaders rethink how to do leadership and helping organizations rethink leadership that benefits both the leader and those that work for the organization. So let's dive right in. So let me introduce to you Michele Thompson. Michele is a leadership development coach, and she is the CEO of Curis Consulting. One of the first things I loved about Michele is when you read her bio, the first line tells you something about how she thinks about her work and how she thinks about life and how she thinks about balance, because she starts with that she is a daughter, wife, stepmom, dog mama, and registered nurse. I love that statement. All of that is in there. That is so much more important than what we do. Michele supports individuals and organizations struggling with how to prioritize human connections over bottom lines and shift from burnout and frustrated to aligned and authentic so they can be the leader everyone wants. Michele believes that we have made leadership far more complicated than it needs to be. Totally agree with her on that. We'll talk more about that. At its core, leadership is an exchange of energy between two people. Leaders must learn how their own lived experiences impact the way that they hold space for others and their ability to create a safe container where people feel welcome and supported. After 25 years of clinical operations and facilitator-educator experience, Michele developed her own approach to creating psychologically healthy workplaces that relieves leaders of their moral distress and feelings that things will never get better within a dysfunctional workplace. Throughout her career, Michele has researched countless leadership models and styles, and she has created what she calls the person-centered leadership approach, which she will talk more about, after realizing there was a need for leaders to focus on themselves and on the individual needs of those they serve. Her approach allows leaders to explore themselves through reflection, visualization, and take action steps to connect the mind and the body, which will provide new opportunities to lead with purpose and from their core values. Her person-centered leadership approach prevents crisis leadership and builds a dedicated company culture which transform workplaces into those that people will never want to leave. So again, please join me in welcoming into the Helping Conversation, Michele Thompson. How are you, Michele?
Good morning. Thank you. That was quite the intro. My goodness. I'm not sure how I feel about all of that, but maybe I have nothing more to say.
Oh, no. I have no doubt you have a great deal more to say on all of this.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
But I just found myself reading about some different aspects of this piece about workplace culture. And, you mentioned in your bio about believing that we've made leadership a little bit too complicated. I was just having this conversation literally yesterday with a client of mine who's moved into a new position of leadership in his company. And that's exactly what we're talking about is can we simplify this a little bit, that we're talking about the land of relationships. So I'm excited about our conversation today. So let's get started. Fill our listeners in a little bit, just a little bit on your history and your journey, and that got you to where you are today doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I will admit that I do have the gift of gab. So at any point, please feel free. But I will try to have value to your listeners, because I do believe that one of the greatest gifts we have for other people is our gift of our time. So I do appreciate that. But, I think that like many, my journey keeps changing, and it depends on the season of life. And, the one thing that I think for me that was always the underpinning was that I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
I always knew that to be true. And the current or most recent dive into entrepreneurship was really one that if you told me I'd be looking at, say, 6 years ago, I would have laughed, because it was not really anything that interested me. I thought that I would be a nurse, maybe working in different areas, but I never really had a desire to become my own business owner. And I think the reason that changed was just that, I do believe to a certain extent the universe brings us to where we are and where we need to be, and presents options in front of us in terms of, making some decisions. It's kind of like that hero's journey. And I about 3.5 years ago, I made the decision to leave a general manager position. I was in charge of a long-term care home for seniors, and that's the space that I had been working in for over 16 years of my clinical career. And I had a national certification in gerontology, and I loved the work that I did. I was just feeling a little bit like, it's kind of predictable. Like nothing was surprising me anymore. And even though as I said, I loved working with the residents, I just felt like I wasn't challenging myself, and made the decision to take a position to go work with First Nations here in British Columbia. And I certainly don't regret that decision, but it was a difficult for me to leave direct clinical practice.
Right.
And as I was transitioning out of that role, a group of physicians that I worked very closely with approached me and said, well, gosh, we wish we would have known that you were leaving, because we would have hired you. And I said, well, thank you. That's nice. But that would have been kind of unethical. And so about 6 months later, time passed, and they reached out to me and said, listen, we got some funding. And do you remember those outcomes that you had when you were working in your long-term care home, where you rarely had any residents that were being transferred from the acute sector, from your home to the acute sector? And I said, yes. I said, well, can you just create some curriculum and then deliver it for us and just teach everybody else how to do what you were doing? So I said, yeah, I think I can do that. And that was really, the first big toe being dipped into the water of entrepreneurship. And my husband has that pull a little bit more strongly. And he said to me, you need to start your own business. So, then came Curis Consulting, and I thought I was saying to you earlier that I thought, gosh, what can I name my company? I didn't want to name it, my name. And I thought, well, what's the Latin form for health or well-being? And it's Curis. So I thought, well, that's perfect. And nobody can say it, and nobody knows how to spell it. So it was probably the first major rookie mistake I made as a business owner. But, such is life. I own it now, and I love it. But, I think that was really just the path that has gradually led me to where it was. And again, that business I thought was going to be around policy development and curriculum development, because I love education and I love sharing information and learning from other people. I quickly learned, however, that wasn't really my why. That wasn't the passion that was driving me to do the business. And at the core, it was around the leadership. And that's because I had had so many awful experiences with leaders who, in hindsight, I can have the empathy for them because I know that they were likely set up to fail and weren't given the tools that they needed. But in that moment of being on the other side of that, I was angry with them for not being able to support me and provide me what I needed. And so that kind of led me now into the work that I do now, and in trying to create a leadership approach, not just for healthcare professionals, but for organizations who really want to value not only their people, but also their leaders.
Right. Yeah, I find myself in these conversations a lot with leaders who sometimes in our role as coaches, that people will share things with us that they wouldn't share out in public, and who will say to me behind closed doors, I don't even know if I like leadership. I don't even know if I want to. I don't think I'm very good at it. But in many organizations, it's the only way to move forward, right? Or to make more money or greater compensation, which is, I just find that conversation always saddens me, because it means organizations are moving people up into leadership and they're not asking, do they have the skills? What do we need to do to help them get the skills, support them, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And that was my experience. Really quickly, I moved across country from Ottawa in Ontario to British Columbia, which is, for Canadian geography, it's from one end to the other.
Yeah.
And in my mid-30s, which I thought was ridiculous, like who the heck does that in their mid-30s? And it was to take a job as a general manager. And it was my first real senior leadership role. And I had been through 3 rounds of interviews, and the employer at that time told me, oh, the building is running really well. This is going to be great for you. And I was more than capable and competent from a clinical perspective to do the role. And I think in hindsight, I was hired on that basis. And I quickly got into that building, and within 3 months, I could physically feel the shift in the behaviors that the staff were exhibiting towards me, even though I was trying to engage them in making decisions and trying to collaborate and create fun in the workplace. And it wasn't until I came to work one day and my admin person said to me, licensing is on their way to the building. And in Canada, that's not an unusual thing to happen when you are bound by kind of government regulations and you have to run your building in that way, that they'll sometimes just have, like, they'll just show up, they'll have impromptu visits. And we had nothing to hide. So I said, okay. And she said, no. They're here to investigate you. And I said, excuse me? And she said, well, one of the nurses has accused you of covering up the death of a resident.
Oh my.
And it literally, like, I still have, like, I get goosebumps when I tell the story, because I still feel the blood, like, literally draining from my body. And I thought in that very moment, my whole career is over.
Right.
Not because I knew it was true, but because I was in a new role. My employers barely knew me. And it was the complete opposite of everything I stood up for, that I didn't know how I would be able to explain that this was a lie. Like, what nurse would lie?
Right.
So after 2 days of a full 2-day investigation, they, of course, came back and determined that I did not do that. And when they questioned the nurse, she said, well, we just thought that if we could get her fired, everything would go back to the way that it was.
Wow. And
it was in that moment that I learned that I was actually the 6th general manager of 6 in 7 years. So things were not okay.
Yeah.
And things were not going well. They were pretty darn dysfunctional. And I realized that I had been put in a situation where I was being set up to fail.
Yeah.
I had no support from senior leadership. And I had no idea what to do next.
Right.
So for the next 3 months, I went to work every morning having panic attacks because I thought, well, what if there's only one person in this building that thinks that that was true?
Yeah.
And that's not who I am.
Right.
It was a real identity crisis I was going through. And it was, again, that kind of catapulted that sense of, no, this is never going to happen to me again.
Right.
I got to turn this around. I got to figure this out. And that was when I kind of started to get really into the deep dive of human connections and how we relate and communication in the leadership space. And unfortunately, this employer I still have contact with. I have many colleagues who still work there, and nothing has changed. And in fact, it's gotten worse. So yeah, I mean, it's there's lessons learned, I think, sometimes, and some people are willing to turn that over and see that as a lesson learned, and others, it just, the curve is a little flatter and it takes a little longer.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we jump into some of the how you do your work, if we knew you when you were younger, if we knew you when you were a kid, because again, as you and I have talked previously, I'm a very big believer that it's not a coincidence us helping people are in the helping world. So if we knew you back then, what were you about? Who were you? What were you involved in? What were some of your activities, maybe values you took from your family of origin that would have been some pretty good indicators that you were headed towards the helping world?
Yeah, well, I'm an only child from a single mother who is amazing, but very strict. And I grew up as a child who loved rules, loved to follow rules. I was an avid book reader. I would say a quiet child, but not, introverted. I just found a lot of comfort in drawing and reading and kind of exploring worlds that I didn't know. So I wasn't a big imaginary kid. But I was in dance. I danced a lot, ballet. I actually thought that someone at one point told me that I could have a career in ballet. Unfortunately, I stopped growing. I say when I was about 8, I'm only 5 feet tall, and that's not really the body type that most dance studios look for a prima ballerina. So that dream kind of left me fairly quickly. But, being that I was an only child to a single mother, my mom was a lab technician, actually in the only hospital that was in the town that I grew up in. And after school, my grandmother would often pick me up. I was very close to my grandmother, and she would often pick me up from school and take me over to the hospital. My mom sometimes would get off at 4 or 5. And I would do my homework. They had a desk in the back, and everybody knew me, and they would just let me go in and sit, and I would do my homework. And if I got my homework done as a reward, my mom would take me up to the maternity newborn floor. And this is remember, this is like in the 70s, early 80s. Yeah. Her friends were all nurses, and so they would let me hold some of the babies in the nursery. I mean, you could never do that now.
Yeah, right.
And I was hooked. I wanted to be like all of them. And I just knew as early as probably 9 or 10 that that's just what I wanted to be. And it never left me. And I'm grateful for that, because I had a lot of friends by the time I got to high school who were struggling in their, final 2 senior years, trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their life. And I think back now, that's so much pressure to put on young adults. I mean, so many people have no idea what they want to do by the time they graduate high school, but it was just in my core, and I knew that to be true. And that's really been, like I said, I'm so grateful for that. And that's also given me really wonderful opportunities to feed a desire for me to help others in need and volunteering. And so it's right after the earthquake in Haiti. I went to Haiti every year for 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
With a group of healthcare professionals. It was we would go, it wasn't affiliated with any specific church group or anything like that, but we specifically worked with children with physical and developmental disabilities in Haiti. And we would train the Haitian healthcare providers to take care of these children rather than trying to come in and save the day. And then when we're gone, these poor children really aren't able to kind of sustain that. So we started the first rehab college in Haiti, as well as the beginning stages of a nursing school. Now, I didn't do that. It was the organization I worked for. It's called Team Canada Healing Hands. There's a Canadian and an American division of that. But I was just really proud to be part of that. And nursing allowed me to do that because I had the skills that I could apply in those situations and help other people.
That's awesome. That's an awesome story about being in the maternity ward. And you're right. Boy, you couldn't get within 100 yards of that these days.
No, you sure could not.
Yeah, yeah. And I very much relate to that. I was one of those folks also who by the end of high school, I knew exactly where I was going based on some of my life experience. There was no question about moving into the helping world. So start to fill us in a little bit on the work that you do and any of the models or modalities or your thinking that grounds you in how you do your specific type of work around leadership.
Yeah. So, I think, so I mentioned this, earlier that one of the things that I have only heard about the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, maybe 3 years ago. And it just really resonated with me. And so I think that, while I don't use that model specifically in the work that I do, it's there for me. And a lot of that call to the adventure and, kind of coming out the other side, being very changed from what you've learned and knowing too much to go back is really kind of at the core of the work that I do. I think the two modalities that I use most often in two different pieces of work that I do that people relate to is in the healthcare space, we have a term called client-focused care or resident-focused care. And basically it's a philosophy that means that when you know your patient or your client well, then you're able to provide very personalized care for them. That makes sense. And so the more you know them, the better the care will be. And we have decades of research that we know this to be true, that people recover more quickly, they go home from hospital more quickly, they have a more personalized vision of their health and wellness and wanting to get better. And yet this has never been applied in the leadership space to employees. And so I very early on, I was like, well, we don't have to do more research. And this is that we've made it more complicated than it needs to be. I said, we already have decades of this evidence-based research. Why don't we just apply it to employees? We don't need to do that. So the leadership approach that I created is like an acronym PER.S.O.N. And it really incorporates that sense of that leader not only knowing themselves in the best way they can, but also really trying to understand their people as a person, not as a team, not as an employee. That's one of the first things I ask people that I work with, organizations or individual leaders, is to stop using the word employee. Like even just take it out of your policies. It should have the word individual, because that's really, it's not an employee. Person works for you, but they're a person. And if you are only looking at them as an employee, that's always going to skew the way that you have an exchange and an engagement with them. So PER.S.O.N essentially stands for, the acronym is the P is personal connections, E is emotional intelligence, R is the respectful communication. So this is, how we use words and the power of the words that we use. S is for self-care. And I've been in that space a lot lately around the burnout and the pieces that you mentioned at the opening of today's podcast. O is for ongoing learning and education, which is important for all leaders. And then N is leaving no one behind. And that's really important, I think, as leaders to recognize that we're in this together and everybody needs to feel that they're part of, to have an inclusive culture and safe workplace, is that everybody feels like they need to be invited to sit down and break bread with everybody else. So there's that piece. And most recently, I've introduced the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs into some of the work I've been doing. And I love Maslow, but I don't completely agree with all of the stages. I think we got things a little bit mixed up, but I use it in the context of self-care. And so because I work in the healthcare space, a lot of healthcare professionals have been struggling with burnout and feeling like they don't have the time to give themselves the self-care that is necessary for them to be able to continue to do the work they do for others. And I just started talking about how you can free up small amounts of your time and how you can do this. And, I called it self-care isn't selfish. And it's intentionally kitschy because people just understand what that means. What I realized very quickly in delivering that training was that I too was actually setting some of these participants up for failure, because at the core of their inability to be able to engage in self-care for themselves was a lot of these other competing factors like perfectionism and people pleasing and not being able to set healthy boundaries. And so, and the biggest one was not recognizing their value and their worth to the people in their circles. And so I started using Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the context that those components are like the corners of the triangle. And in order to be able to get to that self-actualization, the top of that pyramid, or being able to fully embrace your worth and being able to participate in self-care, you need to fulfill those core functions that Maslow describes as air, food, water, shelter.
Right.
Those are things like people pleasing, taking care of yourself through understanding what healthy boundaries look like, and those other pieces I mentioned. So I've started kind of using that pyramid, and people seem to be able to really understand that a little bit better when I teach it that way.
Yeah. So I want to back up. There's a bazillion things here I would love to ask you about. So the first part is I so love this piece about changing language, because it seems so simple, and yet we know how powerful it is. I've shared with you, I do a lot of work in the substance use disorder treatment and recovery world. And that's one of the biggest pieces going on right now is change and move towards person-centered, medically appropriate language. Stop calling people names like addicts and things like that. And that's really powerful, right? Just even to move from employee, stop referring to people as a thing and refer to them as people.
Yeah. And this is why I get so excited to share this without judgment. I mean, I do believe we've made it more complicated, and I don't say that with judgment. But when we start to open up these areas with people, they really realize, they're like, oh, that's going to make a big difference. Yeah. And so then I say, well, if I took your name and replaced it with the word employee, and every sentence that I ever used to describe you or engage in conversation with you,
right,
how would that feel? It would feel awkward and weird. It wouldn't feel natural. You probably would be like, hello, I'm right here. Do you even see me? So how do you think your employees feel when you're addressing them in a way that makes them feel that you're not seeing them as a person? Or when they're hearing the way that you talk about your employees to other people when you call them an employee? It just doesn't feel good. And I think that when people can start to put themselves into the shoes of the people they're engaging with, it makes it a lot easier. And that is, I would argue, I guess, that that's where the hard work is.
Right.
And that's where most of the leaders that I work with struggle, particularly in my program, but even when I'm just working with them through coaching and I go into organizations, is they're just not aware sometimes of their own biases or
right,
the language that they're using. And it's the deep dive and the willingness to go to those places and those parts of ourselves that maybe we don't really know very well and we don't want to let everybody else know about or we don't like. It's being vulnerable enough to be able to go to that place, knowing that on the other side of that is going to be tremendous growth.
Right.
Because if you just sit where your wheelhouse feels good, that's fine. Again, there's no judgment there, but you can't expect that there's going to be tremendous growth and development if you don't push yourself.
Right, right. So I'm curious about the conversation that you have with the leaders that you work with around self-care, because my experience is that sometimes that's a pretty challenging conversation. You have people in leadership tend to be maybe strong-willed, driven. They want to do well, never mind how many responsibilities their organization keeps on their shoulders. What do you run into when you open that conversation up? Because I'm envisioning a bit of pushback. Like, Michele, that sounds really great, but, and so what do you run into?
Yeah, well, generally the way that I start, and I have to be careful when I do this, because sometimes I think when you're trying to be relatable, you can almost minimize the experience of other people by trying to share. And so fully recognizing that, generally what I will do is I will share kind of my rock bottom moment.
Okay.
So that people know that we've all been there. And so my rock bottom moment wasn't that long ago. It was a little over a year ago. I was already teaching all of this self-care, and I was standing in our kitchen doing dishes, and I started crying, uncontrollably crying. And I had no idea why. I didn't feel overly overwhelmed by anything. I didn't feel overly stressed. I just it was like this wave came over me and I started crying, and my poor husband comes in the room and he's like, I don't know what to do. Like, what? Tell me what to do. And I said, it's fine. He says, I know you're going to tell me it's fine. And I know it's not fine, but I don't know what to do. And I said, no, really, it's okay. And I thought in that moment, what is wrong with you? Like, get it together. What is happening? And I really kind of pushed those feelings to the side. And I thought, you're teaching about self-care, and like, knock it off. You can get through this. And a few days later, I came back to that and I thought, this is exactly what I tell the people that I work with not to do. Like, you need to, and don't wait until you're so overwhelmed to ask for help. That should be stage 1, not stage 4, 5, or 6.
Right.
That should be the first place, is to reach out to the people you trust the most, who you can talk to without judgment and openly, who are going to throw their arms around you and say, I'm either just going to be quiet and let you cry, or what do you need from me? And I'm there for you. Like, that's step 1. And I didn't do that for myself. And I was teaching it, and I thought, well, there's something wrong here. So I really had to go backwards and do a deep dive into why was I even pushing that away. And a lot of it, I find, for healthcare professionals in particular, is the stigma that we have created within our own profession, that if you're the first one to tap out, you're weak and you're selfish. Because everybody else is struggling and everybody else is working 16-hour shifts, and they've been doing it for 2 years.
Right.
And if you decide that today's the day that you need to take a little break, nobody's going to feel bad for you, because now you're just not pulling your weight. And I don't think it's ever been done intentionally, but I will tell you that when I graduated nursing school, and I'm not telling you how many years ago, we had this phrase that is still, like, nurses now that I talk to are still hearing it. And it's called that nurses eat their young.
Yeah.
And it was almost like this rite of passage where when you graduated, nurses that were more senior to you wouldn't help you if you asked for help, because they felt that if you struggled enough, that you earned your place. And that was kind of this, like, as I said, rite of passage. And again, like, what kind of messed up thought process is that, where you're not willing, you're in a caring profession, and yet the people that are your colleagues that you should be holding up and supporting are the very people that you're intentionally tearing apart and not helping and supporting. Like, it's kind of twisted thinking. And so I think from that place, I just really kind of realized that I needed to share that story with people, because I needed them to understand that none of us can escape burnout on all of those things. And I think the other thing for me too is really having people understand the difference between some of the words that we use. So resilience is a buzzword that we hear all over the place. And the word itself, I have no issue with. But I do have an issue with the way that the word is starting to be used, in that it is being used, I think, in a way that says, oh, we're just building resilience. And if you just do this, you can build your resilience. And it almost sets the tone for you to be unshakable. Yeah. You're going to get a point where you're completely resilient. In fact, that's just not the case. And so, and it's also defining the words of stress, burnout. And then there's another piece of this that a lot of people aren't talking about, and I talk about a lot, particularly with healthcare workers, is the notion of moral distress or moral injury, which is very different than the other two. And when we sit in those spaces and people understand, I mean, these are healthcare workers, they're science thinkers, when they understand the physiology behind that, they recognize that really it's just their body doing exactly what it was supposed to do, which was to protect them against a perceived or actual threat. And the idea that they can go on indefinitely because they're building resilience is ridiculous. It's not sustainable. So those are some of the core conversations that I start off with.
So I want to go back to one of the first things you said, because again, I think this is a concept that maybe most people don't think about as a behavior that's okay for leaders. And that is, you talked about how you self-disclose, right? And you will share with folks that critical moment for you. And man, for us in our world, I believe, if done skillfully and done authentically, self-disclosure can be so powerful, can be such a moment of connection, and quite honestly, a moment of intimacy between human beings. But I would imagine most folks walking around in leadership are thinking to themselves, not okay, right? That's like too personal. So I'm not going to go there. And yet we know what the outcome of that can be in terms of creating connection between folks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because really it is one of the things that I talk about as one of the first steps to, sort of discovering yourself as a leader is establishing your why. Why do you want to do the work that you're doing, and your core values? Because once you understand your core values, or that North Star that you have, it really helps to make decision making as a leader very easy after that, because it's always founded in that place of that being your North Star. Those decisions will never get confused with taking something personal, or that you're treating a situation different because of the people that are involved. You're really making decisions based on that, and the best way to do that is to build your intuition, but also to lead with integrity, authenticity, and vulnerability. And the fastest way to build trust with people is to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
When people see that you're vulnerable, they're like, oh wow, like I kind of want to learn a little bit more. That was probably really hard for her to disclose that. And I appreciate that she was honest with us. And I believe that at the core, I have two jobs as a leader. It's to build trust and to keep people safe.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I like that. Say that again.
I have two jobs as a leader, and they are to build trust and to keep people safe.
Yeah. All right. I'm just writing that down. I really like that. That's powerful. So,
at the core, again, it's uncomplicating the complicated.
Yes.
Leadership's not complicated. Human relationships are complicated,
right?
But leadership is not complicated.
Right. No, it's not. And yet I know, again, just because of this conversation I was in just yesterday with a emerging leader at a company, we know you can walk into any bookstore and there's 8 bazillion books on leadership, which that alone can lead you to believe, oh my, I'm never going to learn this. I'm never going to figure this out, versus no, this is about relationship and it's about being authentic. And maybe if I just start there, I might be in some good shape. I love what you're saying here about how we have misused and maybe even abused the word resilience. That we're all being told that if I'm really good at what I do, no matter how much you put on my plate, if you're resilient, you'll figure out how to get that done. And then moving that into this, to me, this is a very powerful concept. And talk a little bit more about it, is this concept of moral injury. So how does that get experienced inside a leader?
Yeah, so moral injury is I'm not an expert in moral injury, but I can tell you based on the research I've done and what I know and the experience that I've had and what I've seen others experience, is that people will generally start off sort of stressed, right? Like you start to feel stress, and we all know what stress feels like. But at the core of that, it's generally, it's considered too much. So your list is too long. There's too many things you need to do in a day. The idea is that if I can just cross some of those things off that list, I'll feel better. So there's still this sense of hopefulness, right, and that it's okay. If I can just get some of this done, I'll feel better. And when that kind of goes on for too long, you get to the point of burnout. And burnout, there's many stages of burnout. It's very complex. But really, once you reach burnout, it's starting to look a little bit more like depression. It's not depression, but it starts to exhibit signs of depression a little bit more, because you will have things like apathy.
Yeah.
Sleep disorders can occur, whether you're sleeping too much or too little. Sometimes people can be hyperactive or underactive. But the underlying piece of this is really the sense of apathy. Things are never going to get better, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And you really just can't seem to get those engines running again to start putting one foot in front of the other. And you kind of get stuck. And then that continues to ruminate and build, because often people who get into this place are also overachievers.
Right.
And they're used to being really busy and on the go. And all of a sudden now they're like, I'm unproductive. I can't get anything done. I don't want to do anything. They feel like they're procrastinating. And then the self-talk starts.
Yeah.
You're worthless. You're not good enough. What is wrong with you? Just get off your butt.
Everybody else can handle this just fine.
Everybody else is doing it. What's wrong with you? And I think that when you reach the point of getting to moral distress or moral injury, it can be a progression of a burnout, but it also can be that you can have moral distress at the same time and moral injury at the same time as burnout or stress. And it's really because we know what is the quote unquote right thing to do.
Right.
And yet we're either working in a position or for an organization or within a construct. So let's say the healthcare system that won't allow us to do what we know is the right thing to do.
Right.
And so every day that you put yourself in the position of not being able to do the right thing, it increases that sense of moral injury for the person who is not being able to do what they know they want to do and feel that they can't do it or they're trapped.
Right, right. So I'm curious about something, and not that I think there's a perfect answer to the question I'm about to ask. I just find myself thinking about this quite often when I'm in this conversation. Is all right. So here, people like you and I are here, and we do this work with leaders, and talk about self-care, and we talk about self-awareness, and all of these things that need to be talked about. In terms of this is going to help you feel more effective and move forward in a more authentic way. And then we work for organizations, and organizations love to talk all the time about, we value our employees and we want people to have good wellness, and I'll give you a break if you go to the gym and things like that. But at the same time, the organization heaps unimaginable responsibilities onto that leader every single day. And so I'm curious how you do that conversation with folks, because there appears to be some reality to that. And no matter how much I might try and take care of myself and do some of the things you're talking about, but if I go to work every day to an organization that isn't buying into that and just says, a 60-hour week, a 70-hour week is the norm, what are leaders supposed to do in those moments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm probably going to give you the worst politician response that, I think that it's going to be a different one for every person. And so I think it would be disrespectful of me not to include in my response that for some people, they may have a lot of moral distress in that because they feel trapped in the sense that they may not be able to leave that job.
Right.
If they're the primary, bread earner in their family, and they're concerned about being able to get another job, that might not be an option. And so truly that feeling of being trapped is very evident and present for them. And I just think it would be very disrespectful to say, well, just quit your job, go get another case. And then be quite happy to say, hey, this isn't aligning with me. And so I'm just going to leave. And if that feels right for you, then I would say, then maybe it's just not the right fit. Sometimes it takes for people to really understand what the consequences, for organizations to understand what the consequence of not making change is. And so when I work with organizations, I tell them, in terms of making people feel safe, organizations that do a good job in creating psychologically safe environments through policies and procedures, but also just the culture that they create. So when they create a mission statement, is it just something that's in some manual that you get on the first day that you start a job? Or is it really something that is posted someplace and people see themselves as part of that vision? Because the biggest thing that we need to feel is that we're part of a larger whole. I can love my work all day long, but if I don't feel that I'm contributing to something bigger than myself, at some point I'm tapping out. You're going to lose my interest and the engagement's going to go down. And so what I tell organizations is that really it's good business to be thinking about creative and innovative ways to keep your leaders and your individuals that work for you connected and engaged through different ways that they can be led. Because otherwise you're going to have low productivity. You're going to have, lots of turnover. People are not going to be happy. You won't be seen as the employer of choice. Nobody's going to be telling their friends, this is the greatest place in the world to work.
Right.
Come join us. Like, so all of those things, it just makes sense to do that. But I think that, to your point, I recognize I haven't really answered your question, is that it can start with your like where your location is. And so I have had this struggle personally with an organization I worked with many years ago. And I've subsequently kind of advised other leaders to do the same thing, is that you don't necessarily have to love every aspect of your organization and the approaches that maybe leaders above you are not really subscribing to what you want to do. But you generally have control over your own ship. So the location and the people that you kind of oversee and support. And in that space, I would say, is where you have the control. And that's where you would, kind of really lean into these practices and see how you can show up as the best version of yourself and the most authentic leader within, don't be breaking policies and procedures, but, within kind of that scope and that framework, you can create a space that feels very much you and start to create a leadership style that feels you. And when they start to see that your outcomes are better and your people are happy and, your area is exceeding, all of a sudden now it's going to get their attention. And they'll be like, what are you doing over there that nobody else is doing? Like, now we're ready to have a little listen, because we're starting to see that things are going pretty well. And unfortunately, again, with no judgment, the curve for some people is a little flat, and it takes the obvious thing to kind of hit them in the head to realize, oh, well, maybe we need to be looking at how we do business a little bit differently. And that's really sort of how I came up with the person-centered leadership approach, was just through years of working in companies that didn't always subscribe to my leadership approach and thought it was soft and I was being, too patient with people, and you should just terminate them if they're underperforming, get rid of them. There's somebody else that we can hire. And when I started to show them that some of my approaches were actually giving me exceptional outcomes that weren't being seen across the organization from other leaders, they started to sort of realize that maybe there was something going on that they could learn from.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. So you were talking at the end of the day about doing some incredibly vulnerable making and intimate work with leaders or other folks within the organization. Not an easy conversation to facilitate. And so as you and I had talked about previously, one of my big interest areas when we're in those conversations is, what do us helping people do from the get-go to create trust and safety and a sense of inclusion in this space that's going to allow folks to do this work, especially maybe folks who've never been invited into this type of work. So when you walk into that room with that person and you're starting this conversation, what are some of the modalities or ways of being that you bring in right from the beginning that help to create that safe and trusting space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to think about that a little bit, because I think it's starting to become just sort of second nature that I don't always know. I think that it is approaching every situation, first of all, with humility. I really try. I mean, I'm human, and I'm not a perfect human being. And I don't always get it right. And I think that's kind of the place for me where I try to have every situation that I engage in coming from a place of empathy and humility, not sympathy, but empathy and humility. And also I try to see the strengths that people are bringing to the table. And that's really from the teachings that I got from doing the work with First Nations here in BC, and a lot of elders that I spoke to. Some of their teachings have really shaped the way that I will contextualize some of the topics that I talk about, in terms of just, we have 2 ears and one mouth for a reason. You listen twice as hard as you speak, right? Do you want to be in a canoe, or do you want to be in a rowboat? Being in a canoe is meaning that, you're moving forward. You need more than one person to paddle to be able to get from A to B, and you get to see where you're going. But when you're in a rowboat, you're on your own, and you're paddling, and you're sitting backwards, and you're only looking at where you were, and you have no idea where you're going in the future.
Right.
And when you bring it back down to kind of those simple things, people are like, well, that's cute. But I really do think that it resonates with people in terms of really understanding that it's always better when you're doing it with people rather than when you're trying to do it on your own. And so I think for me too, it's really about just showing up as myself and not worrying about having everything always scripted I certainly, if I'm hired to do certain work, I'm certainly going to be prepared and make sure that everybody's getting as much value as they've paid for, because I appreciate that. However, I think that there's a certain piece of that when you're teaching leadership, you also have to teach, you have to learn to trust yourself enough to just be able to show up as the best version of yourself when you're there to serve.
Right.
And if you're constantly feeling like you have to be scripted, then it's that imposter syndrome. And I think the other piece of that is that really giving people permission to let them know that you're enough. And this is that piece that I talk about around, we've made leadership more complicated than it needs to be. I have, I don't know, probably 60 or 70 of books, leadership books right beside me in my office. And I've read them all and I love them. And it's not about saying that all of those don't work and those models don't work. But at the end of the day, all you need is to recognize that your words have power, and how they land with other people. That is the most important thing that you need to focus on outside of, like I said, keeping people safe and having them trust you. You already have everything you need to be an exceptional leader, as long as you're willing to do the deep dive into figuring out the work that needs to be done sometimes to uncover those parts of ourselves that we push down, or we don't let come out. And sometimes those can be the best versions of ourselves. We just need to figure out how to let them out and have some air. So I think that was probably a little bit of a roundabout response to the question that you have. But, for me, it's a lot of just self-exploration and letting people just sit in that and feel that it's enough. I'm not going to give you 15, if you do this and you do this and you attain these types of qualities and these types of characteristics, you're going to be miraculously a great leader. That's just not how it works.
Right. The other word you've used a few times that I think goes so hand in hand with doing that deep dive, being willing to do that work on ourselves. Most of us human beings have a phenomenal bullshit meter. So, so the need for you as a leader to be authentic. So I go back to your 60 leadership books in your office. You can read all of that, but the key seems to always be, how do I take the information there and distill it down into a way that when it comes out of me, it's me. Otherwise, people just know I'm coming out of a textbook, and that almost never lands well.
That is such a phenomenal takeaway, Keith. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's so important. And I think that it's also so that you can take that knowledge and apply it out of the proverbial boardroom.
Yeah.
We're all leaders, whether we're in corporate positions or not. We're leaders in our life. And I think that people really leaning into that leadership role is understanding how they're holding space in the containers they're creating for other people, not just when they're at work, but in their personal life.
Right.
How do I show up as a stepmom when our kids were young? How am I as a wife? How am I as a community member and volunteering and giving back to my community? Those are all leadership roles. And if you're inconsistent and you're all over the place, you're really not practicing from a place of your core values. So for me, it's helping people establish what are the 3 to 5 things that are non-negotiable in your life.
Yeah.
What are those?
Yeah.
Because once you figure those out, the rest starts to become way easier.
Yeah, we're pretty good. So you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that one of the concepts that you bring into the room in your work is to really help people identify strengths, to be really strength based. So here's the moment in the podcast where you get to brag about yourself a little bit, since I think that is really truly one of the cornerstones of any good coaching is we are strength-based. We see strength and capacity in people when maybe they're in a moment where they don't see it. So give us an idea, in the world of Michele Thompson, some of your strengths, positive, powerful attributes, characteristics that you bring to your work and to life.
Gosh, yeah. Well, I think that one of them is that I do think that I have a ability to ask people to envision things in a way that they've never envisioned them before. Mm. So to, again, from that place of strength is to stop playing the what if game, or if only I had more time, if only I had more money, if only I had, or whatever it is for you in your life. And to flip that and say, what if I had access to everything I could want to be happy? What would that look like?
Right.
And I always go there. Like, that's just the place that I go. And so when I work with clients that I coach, or when I work with, individual leaders within their workplace, I ask them, what is it that you need to come to work every day and at least be pretty much excited that you're there? Like,
Right.
What would that look like? As opposed to saying, what are all the things about my job that I hate? I don't want that. That's energy I don't want to put out in the universe, because
Right.
the universe is just going to respond to whatever I put out, and it's going to try to throw things back at me like, well, that's not really what I want either. Well, then tell me what it is that you do want. So it's really asking people to hone in on what it is that they want and why. Right? Some people think, oh, I just want all this money. Well, why?
Right.
Because money's not going to make you more happy if at the root of that you don't really understand why you want that. So it's that. And then I think, again, we've talked about this. It's the words that I use. I do try to be very mindful of the words that I'm using with people. And also and this is one thing I did learn in working with an elder with First Nations around humility. She said to me one day, her name's Sequalia. She's just amazing. I love her to pieces. And she said, there is no wrong question that you can ask ever, as long as you ask it with humility and with the intention to seek an understanding that is different from your own, so that you can take that and then be a witness and share that with other people.
Wow.
Don't ask me to repeat that, because I probably won't be able to. But that was like, and that has always stuck with me, because I think that we as leaders, but also in the space that we're in now and in where our world is at, it's becoming a little polarized for some people.
Yes,
and I think there are a lot of people who really wanted to lean into that space as leaders, but also as humans, and show that piece of humility and humanity, and kind of extend that hand and say, explain to me, make me understand. Your lived experience is different than mine, and I don't understand. And also acknowledging if there's white privilege present, and calling that out and saying what it is. People are so afraid to have those conversations because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong word or the wrong thing. And I think that when someone truly understands that you're being vulnerable and you are doing the very best in that moment, and really asking from a place of humility, there's nothing you can say that would be wrong. I believe that in every part of my being is that is true.
Right. I know these words don't necessarily mean the same thing, but as you talk about going into these conversations, asking questions with humility, the word that pops in my head is also curiosity. That if we come to these conversations from a true, authentic place of curiosity, then there's no judgment. Then there's not, I'm right, you're wrong. Then there's truly wanting to learn, truly wanting to hear what you have to say, not just have it be a moment where I get to share my side. And I agree, Michele, that appears to be in short supply in our larger culture. So so I always get curious with, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that I think that that's very true. And I see this in leaders who listen only to be able to get their point across. And I always suggest to people is don't try to have a conversation with someone where you're trying to get your point across and it now becomes like almost a battle of who's right and wrong. Yeah. And if you don't agree with someone in that point of curiosity and humility, you can just say to them, thank you for sharing that. I see things differently.
Yeah, right. That's it.
You don't always have to agree.
That's it. The term I've come to use is how easy it can be for some of us human beings at times to get stuck in our righteous sense of rightness. Right? That my right is the only right. And I don't want to hear about anybody else's right. And boy, we know where that conversation isn't going to go. Yeah. Some of the gifts that you walk away with from doing this kind of work.
Well, I always am learning. So, for me, I love being an educator, but I love learning. I'm a bit of a information hoarder, I call it, because I just like to gather information and just constantly be a sponge to learn about new concepts and new ways to think about things, and really like to sit in spaces where I can be around other thought leaders and people who want to show up as the best versions of themselves, not only for themselves, but for other people. I really feel like the world needs that right now. I think the other piece for that for me is just that it's learning, but I think that more from a person perspective, I just continuously love to engage with people that I've never had the opportunity to meet before and really learn about people's lives and how people go about living and stepping one foot in front of the other every day and the life that they've lived and have created and families. And, I find human connection and the human experience just very fascinating to me. So I think for me, doing the work that I do and being able to have that one-on-one connection with people really sort of validates that in a way that I'm not always aware of. But it just makes me feel so full when I get to do that.
Yeah. Awesome. So one of my hopes for this podcast is that maybe some of our listeners are people who are thinking about coming into the helping world or new to the helping world, and maybe more specifically, the world you and I are in terms of doing some coaching. If someone was listening and they found themselves thinking about moving into the leadership development space or organizational development space, what words of wisdom might you pass on?
Do it. Because we need more people. Because I think leadership still is seen as this really dry, boring subject that people don't want to talk about. And leadership, who wants to talk about leadership?
Right.
And it's not. It's just so fascinating. So, I would say that if that feels right for you and it's resonating and it feels like that's where you're being drawn, then listen to what your your inner knowing is telling you and do it.
Yeah.
There's a reason for it, and you may be surprised at, where you end up and land. I would say that for a lot of people, if they're looking to go into a leadership role or take a leadership role, to not be afraid to lean into that, to show your vulnerability through admitting that you're going to make mistakes, and to know that you don't need to have all the answers. That's the one thing I tell leaders. The biggest mistake you can have is to feel that if somebody asks you a question and you don't know, is to feel like you have to come up with some fabricated response or some fluffed version, because people see through that right away. They're like, she has no idea what she's talking about. Like, it's, I think sometimes when our children are younger, we think that we're fooling them. And kids are far more smart than we are. And they're like, I'm not buying what you're throwing down right now. Like, it's not really happening. Yeah. And I think we're the same way. Like, you can tell by someone's body language, they get uncomfortable, just the way that they sit, their posture changes, their face can change. And I think that one of the most liberating things new leaders can learn is that they don't have to have all the right answers. And in fact, it's better when they don't, because what that shows is that they can be resourceful. They can go and find the answers to those questions and then come back and follow up with that individual and say, hey, when you asked me that question a few days ago and I didn't have the answer, I really wanted to make sure, it was important to me to make sure that your question was validated. Do you have some time? Can we talk about that now? Because I think I have a response that might be interesting for you. Right. Like, and it continues that relationship. It will deepen that relationship, that opportunity you have with that individual. So a lot of leaders, I think, when they realize that they don't have to have all the answers, that sort of eases a lot of people as well. Yeah.
I was in a conversation just the other day with a leader who we were having this conversation about him not knowing. And we were talking about everything you just said, in addition to maybe that's even a moment, especially around this relationship building. This is a moment maybe to turn to your team and ask them and allow other people who, that are connected to you to let their brilliance shine, their knowledge shine. Another way to think about relationship building and being vulnerable and not needing to have all the answers. And oh boy, Michele, do I agree with you when I think about the two children I raised, who their radar when I was trying to fake my way through things. Yeah.
They know.
Yeah, they sure do. Michele Thompson, thank you so much. This was such an enjoyable and insightful conversation. I so appreciate you making the time to be here with us today.
Oh my goodness, I'm just so honored to be here, and I certainly hope that your audience found value in the conversation, because it's just been so much fun. I really love your interview style and the type of exchange that we have, where, it's not super scripted. We just get to sit down and I get to have a cup of tea this morning and really just share. It's been a fun morning. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I will make sure for those of you that are listening that in the podcast description notes will be all of the information that will allow you to make contact with Michele if you would like, and her website to get some more information on the really important work that she is doing in helping leaders be more human and understanding that at the end of the day, just as where our conversation started about 60 minutes ago, that this is about relationship. So I do hope that you enjoyed the conversation today with Michele as much as I did. Just such important work, so needed. I like to think our organizations have definitely moved forward, but boy, there is a great deal more work to do in helping organizations be a bit more human. So I thank you for making the time to sit in with us today. And again, I hope this was a worthwhile use of your time. And I hope that you can be with us the next time when we get together to continue to shine a light on the skill and talent of those individuals that invite another into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the helping conversation. Everybody have a great day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the Helping Conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the helping conversation.